Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks, continuing to work their way through spring practice. And it seems like every time you kind of tap into the spring practice buzz, the spring practice rumblings, you might say, you get another name or two that's kind of starting to break out a little bit, show that they could be a difference maker going into 2025. We always say it, this is the time period in spring practice where you start to see guys separate themselves. It's one thing to flash early on in spring practice. It's a whole nother thing to consistently show up every single practice and be a consistent difference maker. And at this time in spring practice, as we start to roll into some of these scrimmages, as we roll into the spring game, this is when guys start to separate themselves. And you're seeing that happen with this South Carolina roster. Now, what makes South Carolina such a fun team to follow and closely monitor during spring practices. This roster, yeah, it starts with LaNorris Sellers, but I feel like the country doesn't appreciate how good how good this roster might be in total going into 2025. And what I mean by that is, what has Shane Beamer done really ever since he got to South Carolina? How has he gone about his business building this roster? Betting on traits at the high school ranks. A lot of the names that South Carolina has brought in were not necessarily bona fide five-star prospects who were the best football players as seniors in high school, but almost all of them had some really intriguing athletic profiles that have really high ceilings if they put it together as football players over the next couple of years. I think LaNorris Sellers is probably the best example. When LaNorris Sellers came out of high school, nobody was talking about him as the best quarterback in the class. But you knew if you followed LaNorris Sellers coming out of high school, the kid was tremendously gifted, just not necessarily the best quarterback just yet. And I think LaNorris Sellers is the best example, but Shane Beamer has filled this roster with, a bunch of guys like LaNorris Sellers who have big time ceilings, big time athletic profiles, who are still developing as football players. And going into 2025, it feels like it's the year for a lot of these guys to, potentially become really good football players. Take those elite athletic profiles, make them good football players. It's not only the transfer portal additions that I think is fun to monitor. It's a lot of guys like a Desmond Yu or like a guy like Fred Johnson who were really gifted kids coming out of high school who might be putting it together going into 2025. Want to go over some more names. I want to talk about some of the early buzz we're hearing from LaNorris Sellers as well. Before we get into it, as always, the South Carolina fans, appreciate you guys. Many of y'all know it's been a blast for me talking this program, really going back to what we saw from them at the end of November. You could tell that the foundation's right. And I really do think this program's kind of going in the right direction, building to something special. I've been having a blast. The amount of support y'all have shown the fellas has meant the world. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with, one of, if not the biggest question mark we have for South Carolina, that is the linebacker room. And I don't think anything, kind of represents what we just talked about better than the linebacker room, where it's, look, there's not a guy in this roster right now that is a bona fide proven production. You know what I mean? There's no, they lose pretty much all their top linebackers who played in the 2024 season. But although there's not a ton of proven production, there's a lot of really intriguing bodies in this room. And the two names that seem to be getting the most amount of buzz, one, Fred Johnson, which I wouldn't say that's a surprise spring standout. We kind of knew that Fred Johnson might kind of blossom going into 2025. What about Jaron Willis? He's a unique guy that I think coming out of high school, committed to Ole Miss. You thought he was going to be an edge rusher, kind of makes the transition to off-ball linebacker. Both Fred Johnson, Jaron Willis are two really talented, juiced up linebackers. They're really big, they're really fast. Well, Jaron Willis a little bit smaller, but very, very fast, can cover a lot of ground. What excites me the most is we know they have the athletic profiles, but this year in spring practice, it sounds like they are getting a ton of reps. Where go back 12 months ago, a guy like Fred Johnson was a true freshman, and Jaron Willis was kind of bouncing around between positions. You had Bam Martin Scott, you had Debo Williams, you had a guy. I mean, I'm looking at the linebackers that are leaving this program. Demetrius Knight probably should have started with him. You're losing all the linebackers that were taking the most amount of reps last year. And so now Fred Johnson, Jaron Willis are getting a lot of reps in spring practice and kind of have the opportunity to, hey, we know they have the athletic profile to be good. Now it's got to come between the years. Well, the best way to get it going between the years is getting on the football field and getting a lot of work. And it sounds like both Fred Johnson and Jaron Willis are getting a lot of work along with Justin Okoronkwo, who might be the most intriguing athletic profile in the room. And then a guy like Donovan Darden as well. The more positive buzz that you hear about this off-ball linebacker room, the more stock you start to buy in South Carolina. Because if you answer that question mark on defense, you start to feel better about what this defense can be. Now, the other question mark is, hey, the inside of the defensive line. Is it going to be good enough? Is it going to be deep enough? Do we have enough difference makers? Very similar to how we talked about the linebacker room. You're pretty much losing all the guys who had the bona fide proven production from last year. The name that I find most intriguing here, really two names. We talked about Gabriel Brown-Ladindi, who to me what intrigues me the most, this is the first healthy offseason we've seen from this kid. You know, five-star prospect going to Texas A&M. I mean, he tore his ACL before he even enrolled to Texas A&M, so kind of missed his whole freshman year. Dealt with a laundry list of injuries the last 2 years. He's healthy. He's practicing. Had a full winter workout. That's big for this kid in terms of potentially being a game record for South Carolina in 2025. The unknown question mark was the number one JUCO commit in the country, Xavier Hardy. Like, is he going to be ready to play significant snaps for South Carolina coming from JUCO to the SEC? The thing that stood out to me was he was one of the coaches said he was the best mover on the inside of the defensive line we've seen at South Carolina in a while, which is crazy because you just had a guy in TJ Sanders who was one of the best athletes at the position across the country. And so it's like, all right, Xavier Hardy's kind of that type of athlete. Now is he big and physical enough to hold up in the SEC? Well, he's up to 290 pounds. You're starting to hear that he kind of looks the part in spring practice. This is still going to be a concern for South Carolina, and it's going to be a concern for us until we see this football team take the field in August or early September. But you're kind of hearing the things you probably would want to hear coming out of spring ball. I would still expect this position to be one that, if the opportunity presents itself in the transfer portal, you'll probably see South Carolina be a major player for a defensive lineman that maybe hits the portal in the spring. Another intriguing, I feel like it's getting misconstrued that I'm, sleeping on LaNorris Sellers, which I promise you guys I'm not. It's more the conversations we've had the last couple of weeks have been around, look, everybody knows LaNorris Sellers is that guy. What I want to get clear is I think the rest of this team is much better than people appreciate. So we haven't talked as much LaNorris Sellers as we probably should be. What stood out to me when Mike Shula took the press conference stand is recognizing the player we saw LaNorris Sellers be in 2024, that there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think what excites South Carolina fans is, look, he was, in the month of November, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, one of the most impactful quarterbacks in the country. There is still a ton of untapped potential with this kid going into 2025, which you really can't say for a lot of other quarterbacks. When you look at some of the other quarterbacks that we like in the last couple of years, how about Carson Beck going to Miami? Look, I think Carson Beck's an awesome quarterback for Miami, obviously dealing with the injury, but is there going to be a massive step from Carson Beck from the 2024 season to 2025? No, probably not. Carson Beck's a good quarterback, but he's probably not going to emerge as a significantly better quarterback than he was in 2024. LaNorris Sellers, the story to me is different. Like, LaNorris Sellers can emerge as an even a significantly better quarterback going into 2025. Now, what were the areas that Mike Shula talked about? One, he recognized having a full year of film with LaNorris Sellers on the football field to go back and watch helps. Last year, so you didn't even know what LaNorris Sellers needed to work on yet because you haven't really seen him play any meaningful football. And now it's, hey, we got 13 games where we've seen LaNorris Sellers play. We're going to go back, look at what he did well, what he's not doing well, what can he do to improve. And one of the things that they noted was we had to run out of necessity too much with LaNorris Sellers. Now, he was very clear. We're not going to not run LaNorris Sellers because he's one of, if not the best athletes at the quarterback position in the country. But we want to run on our terms. We don't want it to be so much off schedule, off script. Hey, LaNorris Sellers, go put on your Superman cape and go be a guy. Because that's when some of the big negative plays happen too. It's nice to know your quarterback can be that guy when it's needed. That's huge. When you have a quarterback that can make things happen when things are going poorly, that's really big. But we want to be a quarterback that we're not running out of necessity as much as we were. And that means, hey, we got to go through our progressions a little bit more effectively, be able to get the ball out a little bit quicker. And how about just consistency as a thrower? He made a lot of high level throws last year, but there was also some throws that's like, hey, we got to be more consistent there. Well, I think it's very reasonable to expect him to get better at that going into the 2025 year. I don't think people know LaNorris Sellers is a really good quarterback. I don't think he's being slept on going into 2025, but I don't think people realize how much better of a quarterback that he can be in 2025. The last storyline is this offensive line. And the South Carolina fans who've been rocking with the fellas, and this kind of goes into the LaNorris Sellers getting better in 2025. I think he's got a better offensive line in front of him. What you're hearing from Rasul Faison is that there might not be the drop-off that I think some of us expected at the running back position with Rocket Sanders moving on. So the run game should be better. The pass catcher should be better in 2025. So you talk about LaNorris Sellers getting better into 2025. Not only he getting better as a quarterback, but the rest of the offense getting better around him. This offensive line just continues to intrigue me. Tree Babaleta getting work at guard. Trevon Baugh sounds like he might be the starting right guard for South Carolina. And I think that sparks the question, what does that mean for the transfer portal additions of Nick Sharp and Rodney Newsom? I think this is how Shane Beamer wanted it to play out. Hey, we're going to go out and grab some transfer portal additions of guys that we know can play quality football. But what we want to happen is that a guy like Trevon Baugh and a guy like Tree Babaleta win the jobs, because the ceiling for South Carolina in the offensive line is higher with Tree and Trevon at guard. And I think it just fires you up in terms of what the run game is going to look like. What's the size of the South Carolina offensive line? They're averaging 321 pounds. Boaz Stanley's coming in at 325. Tree's 335. Trevon Baugh's 335. So massive interior offensive line. Johnson listed at 300 pounds, probably going to play closer to 310 pounds as a sophomore this year. This is an offensive line that your tackles got significantly better in pass protection as the season went on. I would not be surprised if this South Carolina offensive line is significantly better in the run game than what we saw in the 2024 year. And then you couple that with Rasul Faison exceeding pretty much all the expectations that we had since this kid's gotten on camp. He's up to 220 pounds. You talk about the South Carolina offense. I think it's very reasonable to say that you get better at almost every single position, maybe every single position on the field. LaNorris Sellers is going to be a better quarterback in the 2025 year. I think that's reasonable to say. The running back position, I think, is probably holding serve. Rasul Faison sounds like a difference maker like Rocket Sanders was. The pass catches are better. The offensive line might be significantly better. That's what excites me the most, is specifically the offensive line. Continuing to get some surprise standouts. Again, what makes this spring practice so fun is you got a lot of talent that really could emerge in 2025. And it's not just the new faces on this football team. It's the guys that South Carolina bet on over the last couple of years of the high school ranks. And hey, you probably ain't going to play the first 2 years for us. What is year 3, year 4 going to look? Well, guess what? A lot of these guys are not going into year 3, year 4. A lot of these guys South Carolina expected to step up this year. What names are going to be the ones who step up? That's what we're figuring out in spring practice. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.